Some people move through the world quietly, not because they have nothing to say, but because being seen has always felt complicated. They listen more than they speak. They notice details others miss. They choose the edges of rooms, the softer light, the places where attention thins out. To be unseen for them is not disappearance. It is protection. It is relief. It is a way of keeping something tender intact. This is not the story of shyness alone, nor of confidence withheld. It is the psychology of people who avoid being seen because visibility once came with a cost, because attention felt heavy, because exposure asked for more than they could safely give. Beneath the quiet behavior lives a careful emotional logic, one shaped by memory, sensitivity, and an unspoken negotiation between safety and connection. The quiet preference. There are people who do not avoid attention loudly. They do it softly, almost instinctively. They sit where they can observe without being observed. They choose neutral clothing, familiar paths, predictable routines. Not because they lack presence, but because presence has weight, and weight is something they learn to manage early. For them, avoiding being seen is not an act of fear in the obvious sense. It is not panic or trembling or the urge to run. It is calmer than that, more settled. It feels like choosing shade on a bright day, like lowering the volume when a sound becomes too sharp. There is relief in it, a quiet sense of control. This preference often goes unnoticed by others. It looks like independence, or humility, or simply a private nature. But internally, it feels precise, measured. Being unseen creates space to breathe, space to think, space to remain intact. When attention drifts elsewhere, the nervous system loosens its grip, the body softens, the mind feels less exposed. Visibility, on the other hand, carries a subtle tension, not always dramatic but persistent. When eyes linger too long, when questions dig too deep, when presence becomes something that must be performed. Being seen asks for coherence, for consistency, for a version of the self that can withstand interpretation, and that can feel exhausting. So the quiet preference forms gradually. It is reinforced through small moments, choosing not to speak in a group, letting others take credit, staying off public platforms, keeping inner experiences unshared. Each decision is minor on its own, but together they create a way of moving through the world that prioritizes safety over visibility. This is not about lacking desire for connection. In fact, many who avoid being seen feel deeply. They notice emotional shifts, they register nuance, they care intensely about how their presence affects others. That sensitivity, while often framed as a gift, also makes exposure feel risky. Being seen means being misread, or flattened, or asked to explain something that lives better in silence. There is also an emotional intelligence at work here, an awareness of limits. Some people know intuitively that too much attention pulls them away from themselves, that performance replaces authenticity, that observation can become intrusion. Avoiding being seen becomes a way to protect inner continuity, to stay aligned with one's own emotional rhythm. In many cases, this preference begins before it can be named. As children, they might have learned that attention was unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes conditional, sometimes followed by expectation. Over time, the body remembers. It learns that staying unnoticed keeps things stable, that neutrality is safer than spotlight. So adulthood does not bring a dramatic change, it simply refines the strategy. The avoidance becomes quieter, more socially acceptable. It disguises itself as self-sufficiency, as minimalism, as a choice to stay private. Others may admire it without understanding it. Internally, there is often a sense of watching life from a careful distance, participating but selectively, engaging but with boundaries that are rarely spoken. There is comfort in knowing one can retreat at any moment, that one's inner world remains largely untouched by external judgment. This chapter is not about labeling this preference as right or wrong. It is about recognizing it, seeing it clearly, understanding that avoiding being seen is not emptiness, but intention, not absence, but discernment. It is a response shaped by experience, sensitivity, and an unspoken desire to remain emotionally safe. Before anything else can be explored, this quiet preference must be acknowledged as what it is, a form of self-protection that feels natural, reasonable, and deeply human. Only then can its deeper origins begin to reveal themselves. Where it began. Avoiding being seen rarely appears without a history. It is not a sudden preference that emerges in adulthood fully formed. It grows quietly, shaped by early environments where attention carried emotional weight. Long before it became a choice, it was a response. For many, the earliest memories of being noticed are mixed. Attention did not always feel warm or affirming. Sometimes it arrived suddenly. Sometimes it lingered too long. Sometimes it came with expectations that felt impossible to meet. A child who was praised only when performing learned that visibility required effort. A child who was criticized when noticed learned that attention could wound. A child who was emotionally relied upon learned that being seen meant being needed in ways that felt heavy. In these environments, being visible was not neutral. It meant something would be asked, something would be judged, something would change. The nervous system learned this before language could explain it. The body noticed the tightening in the chest when eyes turned toward it. The mind associated attention with vigilance. So the child adapted, quietly, intelligently. They learned to stay slightly out of frame, to observe before speaking, to choose neutral clothing, familiar paths, predictable routines. Not because they lack presence, but because presence has weight, and weight is something they learn to manage early. In some cases, visibility meant emotional exposure without protection. Feelings were noticed, but not held. Sensitivity was acknowledged, but not guided. The child learned that being seen did not guarantee being understood, and misunderstanding felt worse than invisibility. At least invisibility allowed the inner world to remain intact. For others, attention came inconsistently. Love was present but unstable. Praise arrived without warning. Disapproval followed just as suddenly. This inconsistency trained the mind to associate attention with uncertainty. Being unseen became the most stable state, predictable, calm, manageable. These early experiences do not need to be extreme to leave an imprint. They often appear ordinary from the outside. A family that valued achievement, a classroom that rewarded loudness, a home where emotions were acknowledged but not explored. Subtle conditions shape subtle strategies. As the child grows, the strategy evolves. They may become self-sufficient early, emotionally observant, responsible. Adults may describe them as mature or independent. What is rarely noticed is the cost. How much inner energy is spent managing exposure. How often they edit themselves before speaking. How carefully they choose when to be present. Avoiding being seen becomes a way to preserve inner continuity. When attention stays minimal, the inner world remains uninterrupted. Thoughts can unfold naturally. Feelings can exist without explanation. There is less pressure to define oneself for others. Over time, this pattern settles into identity. It feels natural, even comforting. The person may not remember a time when visibility felt easy. Being unseen feels like home. Being seen feels like effort. Importantly, this origin is not rooted in weakness. It is rooted in adaptation, in intelligence, in sensitivity responding to its environment. The mind learned how to stay safe using the tools available at the time. This chapter is not about assigning blame. It is about context, understanding that the avoidance of being seen did not appear randomly. It formed in response to emotional conditions that required caution. Once this is understood, the behavior begins to make sense, not as a flaw, but as a memory still speaking through the present. The mind's logic. What begins as an emotional adaptation eventually becomes a neurological pattern. The mind learns not only from events, but from how the body felt during them. Over time, avoiding being seen stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like instinct. This is where psychology quietly takes over. The human brain is designed to protect. It constantly scans for threat, not just physical danger, but emotional risk. For some, attention becomes coded as one of those risks. Not consciously, not dramatically, but subtly. Visibility signals unpredictability, exposure signals vulnerability, and the nervous system responds by pulling inward. This is not anxiety in its loud form. It is closer to vigilance, a low-level alertness that activates when attention increases. The heart rate shifts slightly. Muscles tighten almost imperceptibly. Thoughts become more filtered. The mind prepares to manage impressions, tone, reactions. Being seen requires regulation. Highly sensitive nervous systems are especially attuned to this. Sensitivity is not fragility, it is depth of processing. These individuals register more information, facial expressions, emotional undercurrents, shifts in energy. When